All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Making the Argument. And today we're going to be discussing the border, but more specifically, we're going to be looking at the Supreme Court decision was essentially cited on behalf of the Biden administration, telling them that Texas was not allowed to interfere with border agents going down and clearing away the razor wire they had set up to try to protect their own border, because it has become painfully obvious that the federal government is not going to do its job. But here's the strange part of all of this. Was the Supreme Court actually wrong with their decision? I'm not talking about the consequences of that decision. I'm saying constitutionally, were they wrong? Because we're going to delve into that issue in a way that a lot of people aren't, because that is the true source of the crisis that we're actually about to experience. So we're going to go through, we're going to give you all the data that you need to actually understand what has been going on at the border. Because I'm telling you right now, as bad as you think it is, we got the charts, we got the graphs to show you that it's so much worse. And this decision, while maybe constitutional, is probably going to have implications that are going to affect not only Texas, but a significant portion of the country for the foreseeable future. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers.
Thank you all for joining us. This is producer Hamilton. If you haven't already, go down to the link in the description and check out our Circle chat. We have a fantastic time over there. I'm sure we'll have a great conversation about this topic right there after the show. Again, thank you for joining us, and let's get right into it.
All right, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, which explains why I'm wearing a tie, because we're in session right now, and I just got in to be able to start filming this because we wanted to make sure that we're providing you good content and things that are happening as it's happening. And I really want to thank our co-host Christian for putting in like pretty much the lion's share of all the work on this to be able to pull this data together so that we could talk about this important topic. But first, I need to introduce my beautiful bride, Queen of the Bees. Hi, babe.
Hello, everybody.
And then, of course, as I just mentioned, our resident historian, political prognosticator, Master Hines. How you doing, Christian?
This is going to be interesting because we've talked about like showdowns and, constitutional crises. And if you stick around to the end of the episode, we're going to get to Texas's response to all this. And needless to say, this could escalate very quickly.
And interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, I actually represent James Madison's district in the Virginia House of Delegates. They actually had something to say about situations like this all the way back in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And we're going to be discussing that as well. And then, of course, we have our producer of producers, Nick Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
Let's rock and roll.
Okay. All right. So let's jump right into it. All right, Christian, look, I'm going to hand some of this off because you have just done some like yeoman's work here and getting all of the data together. But the first thing that we are going to talk about with respect to the border, before we ever get to the Supreme Court decision and the rightness, the wrongness, the constitutionality, et cetera, I think people first need to understand the sheer mass of what is going on, because for the longest time, people have gotten so used to hearing us talk about a border crisis, hearing the news talk about a border crisis, that it's almost become white noise, right? It's like when people talk about the national debt. Oh, it's 20 trillion. Actually, now it's 30 trillion. And it seems like it doesn't affect people in their day-to-day lives, especially if you're not living in certain parts of the country, which are being disproportionately affected by this. But Christian's going to walk us through some data here, which I really think is just going to blow your mind. So Christian, let's go ahead and bring that up and bring everyone kind of up to speed on what the status of illegal immigration and the crisis of the border has been over really the past couple of administrations.
Sure. So while Nick was dealing with the insanity of the Richmond Democrats today, I was hunting down some data on the internet about the insanity that is going on the southern border that is absolutely being facilitated by the Biden administration. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. We've got the numbers to back this up. In fact, there's this one chart that has really made the rounds. This was created just a few weeks ago by an account called Data Hazard. They've got some really, really fascinating information. In fact, Elon Musk has actually tweeted and retweeted some of this stuff. And what's interesting is that none of the stuff that they've put out here about the situation on the border has been corrected by the fact checkers in the community notes, despite the fact that some people on the left have actually tried to do so. And this is after this has gotten tens of thousands of retweets. And what they did is that they compiled the birth rate in the United States with the number of encounters on the southern border. And encounters are defined as basically border agents running into somebody trying to cross illegally into the country. So it's an attempted crossing into the country illegally that either is apprehended or documented in some way. They're still coming in illegally, but we have identified that they've come in illegally. So obviously that contrasts with the unknown unknowns, right? The number of people that are coming in that we have no idea, how many have come in because we haven't detected them. And again, by definition, we have no idea what that number is. Think about how many people are able to cross into the country without being detected, without being caught by any border agents, without being apprehended by law enforcement. That number is obviously significantly higher. So the encounter number, right? The number of people that are entering the country illegally is actually significantly higher than what the encounter number is. The encounter number is just what we know. And when you're just looking at what we know, nothing else, there's just the results are astonishing. For example, for the first time ever in recorded American history, starting in September, the number of encounters at the southern border on a month-to-month basis were higher than the birth rate in the United States. What that means is that the number of people crossing into the country illegally and being identified as crossing in illegally, again, not getting away, still getting away with it, but not evading law enforcement in the process. There's more people that are doing that on a month-to-month basis than there are babies being born in the United States, which is utterly unprecedented. And so this chart from Data Hazard on X, what they did is that they graphed this out and across the entire Biden administration and the Trump administration. So we've got a couple graphs to go through. This one is from October 2019 to 2023. And what they see is that, under the Trump administration, it never really eclipsed 100,000 after you had this caravan incident that took place in, I believe, 2018, where you had a big surge. You had like 1 million illegal immigrants that were encountered at the border. And we've got another graph that can show that visually for those of in our audience that are watching on YouTube and Rumble and places like that. But after that caravan, the number of encounters at the border under the Trump administration were under 100,000 a month.
But Christian, let me stop here real quick too, because I also want people to understand that there's a huge difference with respect to how those encounters are handled. So the Trump administration had a very, very different policy than the Biden administration with respect to trying to make sure that when they encountered somebody, when they captured somebody, that they actually had to wait, like if they were seeking asylum or something else, on the other side of the border or in protective custody or whatever else it might be. And not everybody, but they had a very different policy than the Biden administration, which goes back to kind of playing the catch and release, which means they catch somebody, that person claims to be seeking asylum, and then what inevitably ends up happening is they release them into the United States and they say, here's your court date, make sure you show up for court. And then, of course, most of them do not, right? So the Trump administration was trying to enact a policy where more and more people were required to wait on the other side of the border for their asylum application, which obviously I think makes a lot of sense to most people, since, we very well know that these are not asylum speakers in what we would call the traditional legal sense. In addition to that, COVID also provided additional legal justification for being able to do that. And that policy ended under the Biden administration. In fact, it was interesting, at the same time that the Biden administration was trying to get rid of those COVID restrictions on allowing illegal immigrants to essentially just be released in the United States awaiting a court date, they were still trying to impose restrictions on other people working within the United States, school systems and things of that nature. So I want people to understand that even though you have certain portions of the Trump administration where you have a lot of encounters, the Trump administration and the Border Patrol and immigration under the Trump administration was empowered to actually do their job in a way that under the Biden administration, they're actually handcuffed from doing their job. So I just want to make sure that people understand the difference between those two things and what an encounter meant in one administration versus what an encounter means in this administration. Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Nick. Trump didn't really want people coming to the United States claiming asylum and then being able to be released into the country and then not show up to any court date. He wanted to impose a remain in Mexico policy, and then Biden immediately got rid of that, and basically in doing so announced anybody can come into this country without any objection. Nobody will do anything to stop you. And so what you saw was a tripling in the number of encounters, where when you look at this chart, it went from sub 100,000 a month to north of 300,000 a month, more than a tripling since Biden took office. And when you look at the long-term chart, I need your guys' like response to this. This is the long-term chart here, and we can try to describe this for our audio-only listeners. This again is showing the number of apprehensions and encounters at the border under the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations versus the birth rate in the United States. And
that's incredible.
we're living in unprecedented times. I have nothing else to say.
And look, this is what needs to be understood, and I think everyone does pretty much understand this. This does not happen unless you have a federal policy which allows it to happen. It's not as if Biden is dealing with special circumstances which have never confronted any administration previous to his. He wants this to happen, so he's encouraging it and he's allowing it to happen, and that's why it's causing a problem.
Yeah, and when you look at even the Obama administration, not exactly super hawkish on the border. The number of apprehensions at the border were usually around like 50,000 per month. Now under Biden, it's skyrocketed. And you see this, for those that are just listening to us, you see a big spike in the middle of Trump's administration. That was when he was working to get the wall built. And so there was a surge of people that were trying to cross into the border because they thought that it might be more difficult to do so in the future. So they wanted to all get in all at once. And so you saw like these mass caravans. This was like in 2018 or so, right? You saw like all these caravans. You saw a huge surge. But then after that, you saw a complete collapse. And in the final like year or two of Trump's administration, what you saw effectively was an actual, not fully closed border in the sense that we didn't accept immigrants, right? But closed in the sense that the number of illegal immigrants coming into the country was a trickle. And now it's higher than the American birth rate.
I have a question about that chart being a little bit different, lower under, those Obama years. Does some of the apprehension rate also depend on how many personnel are actually out there to apprehend them? Would there be less apprehensions because there were less people on the border doing the job? That's just a question.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this account actually goes into that. I don't have the other tabs open for that. That might be an interesting discussion for another day, though. But I do know that that's offset, like, any potential fluctuation, like the number of border agents. The other thing that contributed to a decrease in the number, compared to other administrations, a decrease in the number of illegal immigrants that were trying to come in the Obama years was, for a lot of the Obama years, the U.S. was in a recession. And there was far less of a demand for cheap labor because there were far fewer jobs. Think about like the immediate post-2008 period when the economy was still like in shambles and recovering for like 3 or 4 years. And so there was just naturally a lot, there was a lot of suppression on that, pressure for illegal immigrants to come into the United States because there simply wasn't as large of a job market.
Okay.
Yeah. And then finally, the last graph that I have, I actually want to read a little bit here because it really just drives home some of the points. So again, this account says that by all available metrics, this administration's border policy is a disaster. Monthly encounters, again, I have to stress that, encounters have averaged 98,000 for the previous two administrations. That's both Trump and Obama. And now it's 242,000 for the Biden administration. In fact, the flood of humans entering is so vast that apprehensions alone now exceed the combined encounters metric of the previous two administrations. Monthly apprehensions have averaged 34,000 for the previous two administrations and 111,000 for Biden. When we take these averages and since these averages underestimate the current situation, again, it goes into we don't know the number of people that are coming in that we're not detecting. It's getting worse every single month. And by their own numbers, December 2023 was the single worst month in the entire history of the southern border in terms of people pouring across illegally.
Well, and to give you an idea, I think it was 2018. I think it was 2018. I ended up going to, I had a group that was going down. They wanted to go down to the border. They wanted to do interviews with people living on the border just to kind of get an idea of what this was like. And the group was called Moms for America, and they wanted to talk to mothers on the border. And so we went down there late summer of 2018, and these moms who lived on the border and who by the way, I think every mother we interviewed was Hispanic. Some of them were first generation, some of them second or third generation. But this idea or this narrative that this was all fueled by racism and hatred was all just patently ridiculous. Like almost all of the mothers that we talked to still had family in Mexico, visited regularly. They had no problem with legal immigration, but they were trying to get people to understand what it was like for them to live, to raise their kids, to be nervous that if you left your dog out at night, it might get shot. and to really live with this idea that, yeah, you never know what's going to happen. Some people might be crossing the border simply because they want a better life. And you might not like the way that they're crossing, but you certainly understood the motivation. Or it could be a cartel, right? Or it could be human traffickers. And so they were trying to explain to people to just please try to understand that regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, this causes a huge problem. And as an illustration, one of them, who was a school teacher, took us out to an elementary school, which was on the border. And when I say on the border, I mean, here's the school. Right behind the school is the levee to the Rio Grande, right? And she was just showing us how close it was. And the thing that she was trying to point out is that as a teacher, her school would get locked down several times a year, generally because somebody had crossed over the border at that point on that levee and had intentionally come to that area of the school, because what they would do is when you had all the parents lining up to pick their students up at the end of the day, right, they would coordinate with people on the other side to get in that line. And it was a way that they could get over the border, try to infiltrate, get in that line and get their ride. And so every once in a while, somebody would be detected. And as a parent, you don't know why the school is necessarily being locked down, except that they're chasing someone, because the law enforcement at that point don't even know, again, who's this person? Why are they there? They just know they're not supposed to be in the school running around. They're not authorized personnel in the school. And as she's explaining this to us, understand this, as she is explaining what happens, two people climb out of the brush, cross over the levee right down where we can see them, and then Border Patrol happened to actually be there and immediately pick them up. But I can almost guarantee you that what happened next is they went to a temporary facility, were given a court date, and then were released. And so it was this amazing part where she is explaining what happens. And as we are discussing, again, two people come across the border. So please understand that, again, when we talk about this, and I've always been very adamant about the fact that I'm actually, I find people that want to come and be a part of the American experiment, the American dream, that want to be a part of the country, that want to be Americans. I always find that is some of the most, patriotic people that you will ever meet. By the same token, we have to be able to secure our borders. And these women were sharing very real stories that essentially just get ignored as, well, no, you must be a racist. And it's just, I just want to share that so that you know that when we talk about this isn't all just charts and graphs. I've spent time at the border talking with the people to deal with this in a very, very real sense. And it is one of the things that really frustrates me is not just kind of the larger issue here of having a secure border and proper immigration policy and what this means with respect to economics, what it means with respect to social services, what it means with respect to kind of the future, especially as more and more, big cities and localities are actually passing local ordinances which allow people who are in the country illegally to essentially vote. I also... For me, it's personal in the sense that I've met a lot of the people living at the border and what this means for them and what it means for their children. And the fact that those people are just getting, roundly condemned by a very, quite frankly, obnoxious and ignorant political class is really insulting. And I think that one of the things that has been a policy, and I remember when this first started happening, when Governor Abbott and, was it Ducey in Arizona?
And Ducey.
Yeah, Ducey, DeSantis, and Abbott. And originally DeSantis wasn't on board with what was going on, not originally. Because it was Ducey and Abbott that initially said, okay, fine. For all of you cities out there that have declared yourself sanctuary cities, for all of you cities out there that continually vote for politicians to send to Congress, to go to the presidency, that advocate for these open border policies, fine. You are now going to get a chance to experience what we're experiencing here on the border. And they pack people up in buses. They send them to DC. They send them to New York. They send them to Chicago. And amazingly enough, what are those city mayors now saying? Oh, well, this is racism. You're attacking cities with mayors of people of color and everything. No. You said this was our strength. You said this was good. And so great. If you think it's good, here's a whole bunch of goodness for you. And now what are those same mayors saying? Now what are those same local politicians saying? Oh my gosh, instead of saying, hey, maybe we need to rethink this. Okay, we got your point. Let's work together to actually have a reasonable border policy. No, that's not what they're saying. They're calling everybody a racist. And then they're writing to the federal government saying, you need to bail us out. No, the federal government doesn't need to bail you out. You need to learn from the consequences of your actions. And quite frankly, A lot of the people that are in these cities that are mad about this, good, I'm glad you're mad. Now here's what you need to do. You need to make the very logical connection between the problems and the frustrations you're experiencing and the voting habits which have created the policies that have led to the frustrations you're experiencing. And if you can't make that connection, well, then quite frankly, I think Arizona, Texas, Florida, and everybody else who would like to participate should make sure that you continue to feel it in a very, very real way, so that you can understand what they've been dealing with for decades now, and maybe just come to the realization that we actually need to protect our borders, not because we're anti-immigrant, not because we're racist, but because you can't have a massively benevolent welfare system and social welfare system while at the same time you have people flooding over your country at a rate higher than your birth rate in your country. That's absurd. So, all right, sorry, rant complete. Go ahead,
No,
Christian.
that was a great rant. Like, Trump gets a lot of flack for the way that he articulates things sometimes. But when he said, like, you can't have an open border and have a country, again, there were a lot of people that, like, mocked him for the way that he said it. But he was absolutely right. He was absolutely right when he said, we can either have a country or can't have a country. And if we have open borders, we can't have a country. The United States does not exist as an economic zone. This is not the Schengen area, where people can come and go without any sort of documentation or citizenship involved. We are a sovereign nation. And sovereign nations, by definition, have the right to secure their own borders. You have a right to lock your door at your house, and you're not a racist for leaving your door unlocked, right? And likewise, the people of this country, the citizens of this country, have a right through their representative government to determine what the immigration policy for that country is. And our immigration policy, I don't care what the bureaucrats in DC say. I don't care what quite frankly, the Leviathan is out there, the cathedral, whatever you want to call it. I don't care what they think is the morally correct position. The laws in the books are quite clear. Mm-hmm. You're not able to walk into this country and be given asylum without any sort of due process. You can't just walk into the country and claim asylum and automatically you're allowed to stay here forever. That's not what this country is. Again, we are not an economic zone, and if we turn into one, you know what's going to happen is very quickly we're going to turn into the Western Roman Empire. Go ask.
Well, and it's
go ask Majorian and Aetius and stuff like that, and Stilicho how it worked out when they had an open borders policy along the Rhine River.
Yeah.
Sorry. So rant also over on my end, and I agree that like the logical response from a state like Texas is we're on the front lines receiving the overwhelming majority of these people that are pouring into this country. And look, it's not like every single person that's coming to this country is a bad person. I'm not saying that. It's not. But what it is that it is not fair for the people of this country that pay taxes, that have citizenship, that have voting rights, to subsidize anybody from around the world to come in here and claim welfare benefits and asylum benefits. And house them and feed them and provide them basically a way of life. That's not fair at all. And it's especially not fair to have that entire burden be laid at the feet of one state and then tell them that they're racist because they want the states that have voted to implement this current policy to share the burden. I remember when the mayor of New York was going out there bragging on social media about how New York City is a sanctuary city. And then lo and behold, it was like 2 months ago, he's going down to Columbia holding press conferences saying, we're full, please stop coming. Gee, I wonder at the same time
that he's kicking kids out of school in New York City so they can actually house people that are here illegally. It's like, yep, thank you very much. You have demonstrated exactly what your priorities are. And this is also the part that sometimes I get in a fight with libertarians about this as well, because I'm very sympathetic to libertarian philosophy in many respects. But when it comes to immigration, they will have this attitude where like, well, this is just a net economic benefit. And I'm like, look, if you have no welfare state, and the only way that you make it is that you got to go in there and you got to contribute and everything else. Okay, that's one thing. Let's talk about that. But that's not the world we exist in. And sometimes they'll come back and be like, well, that's ridiculous because they're not even eligible for the welfare that you're talking about. Okay. Well, first of all, there's a great deal of fraud with respect to welfare. right? And I am tired of people, who are usually very, very skeptical of the government's ability to be able to effectively, administer programs, all of a sudden think it's perfectly executed when it comes to illegal immigration and the welfare benefits programs. But on top of that, the moment someone walks into a hospital, the moment someone registers their kids for school, it's not like the school is doing an immigration check, right? It's not their responsibility, and so they don't do it. It's not like the hospital is even legally really permitted to check.
Yeah, a lot of times
and
they're
so
not
the
allowed
end result is that you're actually getting the benefit of a number of policies, which you may or may not actually be engaging in any sort of labor that can be taxed in order to pay for it. And the thing is it becomes very, very difficult to even monitor what the total fiscal impact of that is. And quite frankly, the left just wants to say, well, hey, if it wasn't for this, we would have problems in this sector of the economy. Okay, well, great. That's why you have HB1 visas, right? You don't need to be doing this. And again, anybody that believes that the Biden administration is allowing this to happen because they think it is economically viable for the United States, or they think it is overall beneficial, or they think that they're faithfully executing their constitutional responsibilities or carrying out laws which are currently on the books, you're out of your mind. They're doing this for one reason and one reason only, and that is because they believe it is politically useful for them. And that's why they're doing it.
Definitely. Did you see the conversation that the Speaker of the House was having with...
It was Mike Johnson with, what's his name from New York?
Well, basically highlighting the fact that they have policies there allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. And of course, as you know, everything starts with local and it goes out from there. And so when he was highlighting the fact that you guys want to give these people a right to vote, that's why you love this idea of people coming in, because then you can, hook them with all your little benefits and everything, and then get them voting for you. And at first he was like, oh, we don't do that. That's not happening. And then, Mike Johnson cited the exact portion where it said that they were being given the right to vote in their local elections. And we know what their motivations are here.
And one of the most important things as we discuss this potential crisis that's going on is you're going to need to be prepared. And that means being prepared with protein. So GoodRanchers.com is doing a special deal all throughout January where when you go to GoodRanchers.com, you sign in with promo code Nick, use that promo code, right? And you sign up for one of the subscriptions to get some of the best beef, poultry, pork, or wild-caught seafood that you have ever tasted, right? You are also going to get free chicken to go along with that subscription, right? This is a January deal. So you're not just going to get free shipping. You're not just going to get, the other opportunities and discounts, but you're also going to get that free chicken to go with your order. That's like $180 deal. And I'm telling you, the chicken is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Like, I have raised my own chicken, and I'm telling you, Good Ranchers did a better job than what I did with the chicken that I just got out from my yard that I raised organically and all that stuff that people always talk about that make it so good. For some reason, Good Ranchers is even better. So GoodRanchers.com, promo code Nick, go out there, try one of those subscriptions. I'm telling you, you're not going to be disappointed. Also, go onto the store and check out some of the swag. They have got some really funny swag that you're going to want to utilize. I've done a couple in some of the reels I've shot and whatnot. It's some good stuff. Go get that. GoodRanchers.com, promo code Nick. All right, let's get on with the rest of the show.
Well, it starts with driver's licenses, and then it progresses to law enforcement's not allowed to check the immigration status of anybody that they pull over or arrest for a crime. And then it goes to businesses are not allowed to check the immigration status of anybody that they interview or hire. And then it moves on to, well, they can vote in local elections. And eventually what's going to end up happening is that we're going to very rapidly get to a point where it will become mainstream within the Democratic Party for literally anybody in the entire planet to walk to the United States and be able to participate in federal elections in the United States. That will eventually happen.
Right.
And at that point, like I said earlier, the United States at that point will cease to become a sovereign nation, and it will become an economic zone where anybody can come and go and participate in the political process and help elect these bureaucrats and these politicians that will then perpetuate the exact sort of stuff that we've talked about in this podcast over and over and over again. Terrible cultural policy, terrible social policy, terrible financial policy, terrible monetary policy. what's happened is that the left has gotten frustrated at the fact that they have lost the support of the American working class, who they took for granted for more than 50 years. And their conclusion was not, what do we need to do to draw back the support of the blue-collar Americans that we used to take for granted? No, the response was, how do we replace them? That's what the response has been. They're unsatisfied with the current voting demographic, and they want to replace the current voting demographic with one that they believe will be more loyal to them. Now, what I found kind of interesting is that you're also seeing with Hispanic Americans that are U.S. citizens, that do live in this country and are able to vote legally, you're seeing a massive shift to the right with them right now. And you're especially seeing it in places like the Rio Grande Valley. In South Texas, there's counties like Hidalgo County and stuff like that, Zapata County, that moved like 30, 40 points to the right between 2016 and 2020. And I think in part of the reason why is because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're white or if you're Hispanic. The impact of having 3 million people pouring into your country every year illegally impacts you regardless of what your race or ethnicity or skin color is. And it especially impacts you if you're living in South Texas. And so all these Hispanic voters living in South Texas are looking at the Biden administration like, you took us for granted because you thought because we have a certain ethnicity that we must be loyal to the Democratic Party. And then you threw us under the bus in exchange for a bunch of people that currently can't legally vote for you. Why on earth should we continue to give you our political loyalty? And you know what? That's going to continue to accelerate, just like you're seeing it happen in places like Miami-Dade County as well. It's not just in South Florida. What you're seeing is a full-blown revolt, again, among large segments of the working class in the United States against the Democratic Party that's operating explicitly against their interests, because they have, as you said it best, Nick, there's only one reason that they're supporting this policy, and it's because they think politically it'll pan out for them.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because the first way, because if you look at this, and this is kind of where we're going to get into some of how the way the states have responded to this, because the response in the past, because people have always asked, why don't you deploy the National Guard? Why don't you deploy more law enforcement? Why do you do these things? And it wasn't because you didn't have states that weren't willing to take those sort of measures in order to try to provide for their own security issues and whatnot. It's because the federal government has jurisdiction over both immigration policy and border security. And we'll talk specifically about the article in the section which covers that. But here's what happened. It created a scenario where you would basically told states, you're not allowed to protect the border and we're not going to do it for you. And so that's why you saw states resorting to, okay, fine. Then you know what we can do? We can bus or fly them to your sanctuary cities, and then we'll see what happens. And here was the interesting part. As I said before, these cities started to realize like, oh, this is a problem. But instead of admitting that, okay, maybe we should actually, course correct with respect to our little woke progressive policies, it was, no, I'm just going to scream and cry at the federal government and now demand that I get more money in order to take care of this problem. Again, I don't want to actually stop the problem. I don't want to actually deal with the source of what's causing this. I just want more money, and you need to give it to me. And everyone else needs to pay more taxes. It's like the spoiled brat approach to policy. You made a bad decision. You're now paying for it, and you want other people to pay for it, and you just want to continue to engage in the bad policy. So states essentially tried to spread around the wealth, right, of what was actually going on, and that still didn't get people to do an accurate course correction. And so now states took the additional, Texas went so far as to say, fine, we're mobilizing any forces that we can with respect to law enforcement, et cetera, to be able to go down there and actually deal with the situations that are the worst trouble spots on the border. And that's what they did. They went down there. They first tried to set up, I think we've got a picture and an article addressing that, but Arizona was putting, shipping containers on the border to try to create a barrier, and
then they got
Texas,
sued for it.
And they got sued for it. And then Texas put what were those like buoys in the Rio Grande in order to try to prevent people from swimming across the river. And of course, the media immediately jumped on people that got hurt because they actively got in the water, actively tried to swim across the border, hit the buoy, and instead of going back, we either got tangled up on it or something got hurt. And it was like, oh my gosh, what a mean, horrible, inhumane process, as if somehow, putting buoys within the United States side of the Rio Grande constitutes, them forcing people to get in and swim across it. And what we saw is that every time Arizona or Texas tried to take reasonable measures to be able to provide for their own, security on this, because the federal government was failing to do it, The federal government, instead of saying, okay, we get it, we hear you, we're going to go do something about it. No, what did the federal government do? What did the Biden administration do? They decided to expend time, money, and resources suing the states, right? Not time, money, and resources dealing with the problem. Time, money, and resources suing the states who now felt forced to deal with the problem themselves. And this latest manifestation of it was, again, largely around Eagle Pass. I got that right? Eagle Pass?
Yeah, it was Eagle Pass.
Eagle Pass. So you had this major source of problem. Texas said, we're done. Went in, sent their own law enforcement, concertina wire, razor wire, people to do it, to the point where when the feds came down and said, you can't do this, Texas said, yeah, well, we're doing it anyways. So again, what did the Biden administration do? Did they say, okay, guys, we get it. This has just reached a problem where even we have to acknowledge it's a problem? Nope. They spent time, money, and resources suing the state. And they went to the United States Supreme Court and they got a 5-4 decision. So what ended up happening was a circuit court didn't give them the opinion they wanted. So they appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court essentially came down and said, no, the federal government is authorized under the Constitution to go and access the border. The state cannot create a barrier to where the federal government is not able to go down there and essentially execute its authority. Now, here's the part that, because obviously everybody's screaming about this. We've seen people say that, essentially what they just did is the Supreme Court has now ruled that, essentially the federal government apparently doesn't have to protect the states, and the states aren't allowed to do it either. And there's an enormous source of very obvious and very reasonable frustration for what this Supreme Court decision means with respect to giving the federal government access, because what's going to happen is they're going to be under orders by the federal government, by the Biden administration, to remove those barriers, and then the flow is going to continue. And a lot of people are saying, well, the problem here is that, Roberts and Cohen were just the weak links on the conservative members of the court, and they sided with the liberals in order to give this 5-4 decision. And that's the real problem. I'm going to tell you right now, I actually see this a little bit differently. I don't like this decision, but I am having a really hard time, if I'm being intellectually honest, as a constitutionalist, I'm having a really hard time actually seeing where they were incorrect. Now, before you immediately change the channels and you get furious with me and you think I'm something that I'm not, here's the problem. There is no question that the United States Constitution grants the federal government the primary jurisdiction with respect to enforcement of immigration policy and border security. If you look at Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, the federal government has both a responsibility and the jurisdiction. And this is where the supremacy clause of the Constitution comes into play. Now, a lot of times the left will try to use the supremacy clause as a way of saying that, well, if the federal government's decided to do something, the supremacy clause means federal government overrides state laws. No, that's not a proper interpretation of the supremacy clause. The supremacy clause is supposed to apply to those things that the federal government does, which they have specific jurisdiction on in the enumerated powers listed to the federal government. The problem here, in my opinion, is actually so much worse than what people think it is. I don't think it's necessarily about the 5-4 decision. I don't think they necessarily got that wrong with respect to federal jurisdiction. The real problem is, where's the decision which essentially holds the federal government as being completely, obviously, and deliberately derelict of duty with respect to providing for the security that they are constitutionally obligated to provide? You see, the federal government, and especially the Biden administration, has gotten very, very good at arguing before the Supreme Court on where their authorities lie, while at the same time completely dismissing and ignoring their responsibilities. And so the issue that's going to have at this point, and we got Article 4, Section 4 up. Here's what I'm going to tell you. I don't think the Supreme Court got the decision wrong, but I think Texas needs to go forward and push back anyway. And this is where we get into discussions that we've had before on this podcast. This is where we get into that comment I made earlier in the show about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and what is referred to as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And what that is based off of is this idea of what do you do? What recourse do the states have when the federal government either has an obvious responsibility that they are ignoring, or when the federal government oversteps the constitutional limitations which exist on its power? And what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison offered as a solution to this, and I want to be intellectually honest here, Thomas Jefferson was very consistent about it. James Madison kind of flip-flopped over time. But the whole idea between the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions is that the states had both the authority and the power to engage in what has become known as nullification and interposition. Nullification is when a state basically looks at the federal government and says, we think you're overstepping your bounds, and so we're not going to assist you in the enforcement of whatever the policy is that you're trying to implement. We're not going to assist you in it because we believe it falls outside of the enumerated powers granted you by the Constitution. That is a classic case of nullification. Interposition is when the state uses its own assets and authorities to then step in and prevent the federal government from overstepping its boundaries. Now, what's very unique about this case is that if you look at most situations with respect to nullification and interposition, the historical examples, and there's been good ones and bad ones. Let's just be honest with that right now. There's been very, very bad manifestations of states attempting to apply nullification. Some of those happened during the civil rights movement. But there's also been positive manifestations of it. One of the most popular references is when Wisconsin refused to enforce the Runaway Slave Act and then went so far as to actually throw in jail a federal marshal who was attempting to apply the Runaway Slave Act. But most of the examples that we have of it is a state pushing back on the federal government because they think the federal government has overstepped its boundaries. This situation is more unique because you have a case where the federal government refuses to make good on its responsibilities. And I actually think it makes a much better and fresher case for the principle of nullification and interposition. So even though you could make a constitutionally consistent argument, again, I'm not saying I like the decision, but you can make a constitutionally consistent argument that the 5 on the Supreme Court, 3 of which I never agree with, and 2 who I have a lot of problems with, because I'm a big fan of especially Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch. You could say that, okay, great. Yes, you have jurisdiction. And so therefore the Supremacy Clause applies. And so therefore a state is not permitted to prevent the federal government from carrying out its duty. But the federal government isn't, and is in fact complicit in actually negating its duty. So it's not simply a matter of the federal government has decided to not live up to its obligations and its responsibilities. It's actively subverting it. And this is the part where the Supreme Court has it within its power, should the proper case be brought before them, to essentially fine the agencies in the Biden administration as being derelict of duty. Now, in that case, what do you do? What is the constitutional remedy for that? And I think that's why I say at this point, Texas should immediately sue the federal government again and be very, very specific on why they're suing them as a complete dereliction of duty under Article 4, Section 4. But then what they also need to do is they need to take proactive measures to say, okay, the Supreme Court made their decision, but the bottom line is we still have an obligation as Texans to step in and defend our citizens when the federal government refuses to do so. And I think the issue has to be forced. I think the issue has to play out this way because one of 2 things is going to happen. Either the federal government is going to back down, or we're going to have a constitutional crisis that, quite frankly, we probably need to have. Because for too long now, the federal government has gotten away with doing things that it was never intended to do. And now it's refusing to do one of the very few things it was actually designed to do. And so I think this fight needs to take place in the courts. But by the same token, I completely understand why a governor would say, fine, but we're fed up. And we're not going to continue to pay with our own citizens' blood and treasure because the federal government is now actively working against its responsibilities. So that's my take on this. I'm going to open it up to Christian because I think Christian has a different take on the 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court. But I wanted me to make sure that when I said that, which I know is going to be controversial with some people, I wanted them to make sure that they were hearing it in the proper context of which I meant it, both legally and historically. So there's my 2 cents. I would love to be proven wrong on the 5-4 decision, but I think regardless of what we conclude about that decision, the far bigger issue is the federal government absolutely not only refusing to do its job, but actively participating in the dereliction of its own duty.
So, I mean, I don't 100% disagree with Nick here. I if anything, I agree with probably more than 50% of what he just said. I certainly agree that Texas should have and still should make the argument that the federal government is in violation of Article 4, Section 4. And I think we actually need to read this off for our audio listeners only that don't have the ability to see this up on screen. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution states, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive, wherein the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. So that part about protect each of them against invasion. Ladies and gentlemen, at some point when 1% of the entire country's population, equivalent of 1%, is coming into the country illegally every single year, that's it. At what point does that not, do we say that this is an invasion? This is, quite frankly, this is what happened to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. I hinted at this earlier in this episode. The Romans were fantastic assimilators. I mean, they spread across the entire Mediterranean. They could turn Etruscans into Romans. And if you know anything about, they could turn Greeks into Romans. And if you know anything about ancient history, that was a monumental task. They could turn the Samnites into Romans, right? But when you have entire nations moving in, not a couple 100,000 people or over the course of decades, right? Which is what happened. The Rhine and Danube border, they did allow people across. But when you had whole tribes, right? When the Visigoths and Vandals and Ostrogoths, when they're pouring across the Rhine River in the early 400s, and there's no assimilation, well, lo and behold, you didn't have a country for much longer. Instead, you literally had a deep state, right? You had nations within nations forming and popping up. That's how you ended up with Germanic tribes taking over North Africa, right? And do I think that something like that is inevitable in the United States? No, of course not. But there is something to be said about when you're importing illegally 1% of the entire country's population per year. That's unprecedented. Yes, in my opinion, that constitutes an invasion. And the pushback that I have to give, because I know we actually have some people that comment sometimes and they're like, I'm sick and tired of Nick and Christian just talking for 2 hours, agreeing with each other all the time. So the pushback that I have to give is that I think that the Supreme Court had an opportunity right now to make that point in this case, and they chose not to. And that's what I think is incredibly upsetting, because right now we live in a country right now where it is illegal for me to take certain firearms across state lines. If I take certain firearms and I transport them across state lines, I will be ruthlessly prosecuted by the federal government for doing so. But if somebody illegally crosses the border into the United States, not only are they allowed to do it, but that same federal government that would prosecute me for transporting a gun across state lines as an American citizen is actively working to encourage people to cross into the United States illegally. That is about as close to the definition of anarcho-tyranny as you could possibly get, where the government systematically will prosecute you for one thing that, quite frankly, I would argue is actually unconstitutional. I don't find any authority within the Constitution for the federal government to regulate the interstate, commerce trade of firearms between states.
Not after the incorporation doctrine.
But, that's a whole discussion for another day.
Well, it's also happening. I read an article recently about them using, for illegal immigrants who do not have any identification, they are using some kind of special app that American citizens are not allowed to use. We absolutely have to have an ID when we board a plane, but they don't have to. They can use some kind of little app that shows some kind of little whatever.
Here's an even better analogy, Tina. And you and Nick would actually know this because you do a lot more homesteading than I do. Try to transport honey across state lines and see what happens.
Well, if you're trying to sell it commercially.
Yeah.
So we have a federal government that will ruthlessly prosecute you if you tried to sell your honey that you grow with your bees and your beehives at your house, and you tried to sell them to a listener of our podcast in, say, California. The federal government will be coming after you. But if you cross into the country illegally, not only are they not going to stop you, they're going to actively work to help you do that. And they're going to sue states that try to prevent that from happening. That is where I think the absolute outrage on the right is coming from. And I think it's completely justified because, again, it is as clear as day of an example of anarcho-tyranny as I think I've ever seen in my entire life. I don't think that the framers ever envisioned the supremacy clause being used to help federal bureaucracies subvert federal immigration law by prosecuting states that are trying to defend the American border that the federal government refuses to defend. And quite frankly, who could blame them for not foreseeing something like that from ever popping up? Who on earth in Philadelphia in 1787 could have foreseen a situation where the federal government is suing states in order to prevent the execution of federal law that the government is not following? And I don't just mean federal law, again, against the transportation of honey. I mean federal law in the defense of the country's borders.
Well, and I think this is, the point I was trying to make earlier, and the reason why I think that this is so much more of a crisis than people are actually giving it credit for, is because their opinion is that, well, if we just had a slightly different Supreme Court, we would have gotten a decision that we liked, and that would have been better. Okay, maybe so. But the real problem here is that if we just get the decision we want without actually addressing what's going on, we're actually in worse shape. I think people need to understand how unique this is in U.S. history and how dangerous it is. Because like I probably said more times than people care to hear, when you say that the federal government is completely violating the responsibilities in Article 4, Section 4, again, not just a dereliction of duty, a proactive attempt to subvert their own responsibility, right? Like that's it. Like they're not just allowing an invasion, they're taking place in it. They're assisting it. And this is the part where you have a real question on the Supreme Court side. And let me just say this right now. I don't buy in with accusing everybody that I disagree with, even when they propose policies of treason or whatnot. But there is a real case to be made. If one of the states, if one of the people with actual standing could make this argument with the Supreme Court, that what we're dealing with here is, again, not a mere dereliction of duty, but an act of subversion on behalf of the federal government that is not only allowing this to take place, but is actually participating. And so my question here is, I don't want to say that, I guess the supremacy clause doesn't apply right now because I don't like what the federal government is doing. No, I want the federal government to be held accountable on what they're actually doing. And the problem is not necessarily, obviously the problem is the fact that the federal government is doing all these things and they're using the supremacy clause for cover, but it's just so much worse than that. And that's the thing that we need to be highlighting. Not just that, okay, well, I guess Barrett and Roberts are squishes. Okay, fine, whatever. But the real problem that's taking place right here in the constitutional crisis, it is going to create, because like I said, I think Texas should look at the Supreme Court and say, and you, Christian, you said this too, as we were talking earlier, it's like the Supreme Court's made its decision. Now let's see them enforce it. And look, I don't say that lightly, but what else is the state supposed to do at this point?
Okay, so maybe the disagreement was more me not fully understanding the direction that you're going, because it's not like you're endorsing the policy position here. Obviously you're not.
No.
And it's not even like you're endorsing the idea that it's correct for the Supreme Court to give carte blanche to the federal government to not just ignore its own responsibility, but actually actively sabotage its own responsibility. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, it sounds like that you're saying, maybe we need this to happen because we actually need pushback from the states. And if you get some sort of constitutional showdown here between the state of Texas and the federal government over this, that that then leads to that sort of legal outcome that is favorable to what we believe in here, then maybe that's actually a lot better than simply delaying this with a Supreme Court, siding because let's be honest, the Supreme Court has sided against the Biden administration on other things in the past, and the Biden administration has totally ignored it. Think about the student debt thing, for example, right?
Yeah.
The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. What did Biden do? He just totally ignored it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really solve the problem. But in Texas's case, if Texas decides what you just said, right? Okay, great. The Supreme Court has now made this decision to let them enforce it. Oh, wait, they can't enforce it, but we can. And they actually engage in nullification and actually goes a step further and engages in interposition, which, like you said earlier, there's a difference between those two things. Interposition is you're now actively preventing the federal government from doing something.
Yeah, the way to think of it is nullification is kind of a passive response. Interposition is a proactive response. And I think at this point, if I'm in Texas and I'm in the legislature there, and I'm not, but if I'm in the legislature there, I'm looking at Governor Abbott and saying, do what you need to do. We got your back. And I want to see what the federal government does next, because again, what I don't want the Supreme Court to necessarily make a bad decision with respect to the supremacy clause. I want the Supreme Court to make the right decision with respect to addressing the federal government's active participation in subverting Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. That's where I want the decision from the Supreme Court. That's the opportunity the Supreme Court has in order to step out and say that. And one of the most frustrating things that we have about the Supreme Court decision is this isn't a typical decision, right? They're just ruling very briefly on a lower court's decision. And so we don't get dissenting opinions from Gorsuch or from Thomas or from Alito or from Kavanaugh. Like if Thomas was writing a dissenting opinion right now, or Alito was writing a dissenting opinion where they came out and they said, we recognize the federal government's jurisdiction with respect to the supremacy clause. However, there has to be a state mechanism. And I don't know, maybe they use it as, again, I don't know what constitutional mechanism they use to say that because the federal government has so badly mismanaged or has actively subverted, therefore the states, this goes back to the idea that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, right? And so what is the state mechanism for fighting back when something like that is happening?
Well, the Constitution is a contract.
And that's why I'm saying, like, I would love to see, like we actually have the Supreme Court has a unique ability right here. And I want to see what those that dissented on this opinion, I want to see what their justification was for dissent. Because if they're just dissenting because they don't think the supremacy clause applies in this case, well, now I'm questioning the constitutional interpretation. If on the other hand, if they're actually acknowledging what the federal government is doing and what the federal government is refusing to do, and then saying that therefore a state does have the ability or the inherent right to be able to protect its own citizens, that's going to be a very, very interesting constitutional question, because it's going to potentially set a precedent, not just for this, but a whole host of other issues. And it's a discussion that needs to be had, because for too long now, the federal government has grown far beyond any justification, any constitutional justification. It has assumed for itself certain authorities and powers, not based off of it being enumerated to it by the Constitution, but because through its taxing authority, they've essentially been allowed to extort the states and the citizens in those states with their own money. Because if they can come and take your money and then only give it back if you do what they say, they can easily say, well, the federal government's not forcing you to do it. Well, if somebody comes in and robs my house and they say the only way you get your stuff back is if you do what I want, and then they say, well, I didn't force you to do what I want. It was just a condition of getting your stuff back. That's coercive. And so the bottom line is this has been coming to a head for a long time, and we now have an administration so subversive and incompetent that this is the time to have this fight, and it has to be had. And so again, I highly encourage Texas to continue forth with protecting its own citizens,
it looks like that's what they're doing.
And by proxy, protecting the rest of the country as well.
Right. It looks like that's what they're doing, because they're still putting up razor wire barriers and everything else along the border. Yeah. So it sounds to me like they're taking that approach of let's see you enforce it.
Yeah.
So I just want to jokingly take credit before the Babylon Bee does that I'm the one that first coined the phrase that the Supreme Court has ruled that national borders are unconstitutional. I got the tweet pulled up here. That's where I brought up the argument that like this is a state of anarcho-tyranny where the federal government actively subverts the defense of our international borders, but then ruthlessly prosecutes people who, again, transport goods or, engage in services across state lines in violation of federal interstate commerce laws, many of which I think are completely unconstitutional. I don't think the federal government has the authority to regulate the sale of unpasteurized milk across state lines, for example. But they do. And again, they ruthlessly impose the laws that they have on the books on that, despite the fact that I think those are unconstitutional and they don't have any sort of legal justification to do so. They will enforce that, especially if they think they can get money out of you and enforce it.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing how eager the federal government is to tax, regulate, impose, and punish its own citizens while simultaneously robbing from their own citizens in order to provide a wealth of services to people that have essentially come into the country illegally. And again, this is one of the far bigger crisis. So we're talking about the constitutional crisis. We're talking about the practical crisis, the economic crisis. But really what this illustrates for anybody paying attention is that for the first time in a long time, what we're really confronted with in this country is the fact, we've discussed this before, that we have a major political party, which right now has the majority of power within Congress and obviously with the executive branch, that has a vision for the United States that is diametrically opposed, not just to what many of us on the right or even just right of center would want, but really is just diametrically opposed to the sort of constitutional system that we have. As much as they talk about democracy, they don't mean our democracy, they mean theirs. And forget for a second that, yes, we live in a constitutional republic. But again, for them, that's part of the problem. The Constitution is part of the problem. They don't mind using it when it's beneficial, just like they don't mind ignoring it when they don't think it's beneficial. And you ask, well, how you can't do that. And that is what is one of the primary problems and sources of frustration on the right is we keep looking at this going, but you can't do that. Why? The Constitution doesn't permit you.
The Constitution
it doesn't make sense. It's not good.
Though.
And the response whenever they don't get their way in court or the response whenever they don't get their way in an election is, well, you're all racist, you're all sexist, you're all bigoted, you're all part of this patriarchal power structure that was set up to diminish and harm marginal populations in order to prop up white supremacy or whatever else nonsense. They will come up with that, right? They will use all of those institutions that we're supposed to actually look at with some degree of reverence or at the bottom line, a modicum of respect. And they will utilize them against us when it serves their purpose. And the moment it doesn't, they will attempt to disregard it or defame it or rewrite the history or intention of it, subvert it, undermine it. And it goes back to this whole idea, and James Lindsay talks about this all the time. The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. And if they honestly believe that this country was conceived in white supremacy and evil, and because of all of that, the country and the Constitution is irrevocably tainted by it, and therefore needs to be supplanted or replaced, or at the very least, only controlled by people who think the way they do and want the things that they want, well, then where does that leave us? Because what these institutions used to provide us was a very clear list of rules governing the way that we would interact with one another when it came to our legal system, when it came to the use of government force in order to achieve objectives. Right? We had a process that maybe not perfect, maybe not always yields the proper result, but at least could be clearly understood and made an active effort to ensure that people could be included in that process, with the understanding that what was unique about the American experiment was not just democracy or democratic processes, or even just being a constitutional republic. What was unique was that our government was set up from the get-go with this concept that the government must be limited and controlled so that freedom could flourish. Not a government that was empowered to do whatever one party or either party wanted done, but restricted. And now we have a political party that, for all intents and purposes, doesn't genuinely believe that. They're incredibly powerful. They have an incredible amount of control over most of the culturally shaping institutions within our lives. They have almost universal control over your public education system and higher ed. And quite frankly, they don't want to live in a country with you unless you're willing to sit down, shut up, and do as you're told. They don't mind you going to work as long as you're paying the taxes in order to actually run the organizations that they're going to utilize to undermine the very systems that you're trying to support. And this is a demonstration of that. This is not an isolated incident. This is not a bunch of politicians that just decided, hey, we just want to be welcoming to immigrants. That is not what this is. And all of these various decisions and the way they are manifesting themselves right now should serve as a demonstration that, again, you have a major political party. I'm not saying everybody that affiliates with that party. I'm not even saying everybody that might be elected in that party. But you can no longer honestly look me in the face, see what's going on, and then tell me that the Democratic Party in this country actually wants to preserve the United States and the Constitution in any way that resembles what most of us grew up with. They think it's fundamentally evil, and the moment that we push back, they say we're fundamentally evil, and whatever means they have to do in order to wrestle control away, in order to get the power, they're going to do it. Not because they're evil and they're some sort of Bond villain, but because they honestly believe they're doing the right thing and they're protecting their vision of what the country should actually be from us. And that's a pretty dangerous position to be in. But I think that's where we find ourselves.
Nick, before we move on to what's going to happen here in terms of a potential showdown between Texas and the federal government, I briefly want your take on the constitutional implications of this beyond just what we were talking about with the court ruling, because there's been a lot of chatter that I've seen on the right that's almost like black-pilled, and I'll be honest, I'm falling into this as well. And what I wrote here, right? How the Supreme Court ruled that national borders are unconstitutional. I know that that's a bit joking, but there's something to be said there that I still get this feeling that it's like, you know what? The left is right when they say it's just a piece of paper. Now, they mean that in a totally different way than when I say it. I say it with a bit of dejection and disappointment in my voice, but they say it with glee, obviously. And I found this random Twitter account. I don't know this person, but they had a take that I thought was if you don't agree with it, I think it's understandable. And I just want your reaction to it. I want to read it to you. Yeah. This person says, really hard to overstate how heinous this is. The federal government is legally compelling a U.S. state to facilitate its own invasion and illegal occupation by a foreign population. The framers had no reason to foresee a federal apparatus employing the Supremacy Clause to actively subvert and prevent the enforcement of its own laws, nor should they have. They had no reason to plan for the emergence of a suicidally insane class of predatory elites, actively hostile to their own interests, those of the American people, and civilization at large. If you still don't understand at this point that the Constitution is a dead letter in every way that matters, you're not living in reality. Now, that's a bit of a black pill take, obviously, but I don't think that it's a completely unfounded and unwarranted take, even if people might disagree with it. So the reason I bring this up is because I want your take on this, because I know that you might disagree with certain parts of this. But
I think that everything he said was completely accurate all the way up until the very last sentence. And it's not because I don't believe that there's any, we'll say, potential truth in the last sentence. It's that I am not at a point yet where I'm willing to say that the Constitution is just a dead letter. Now, I think he is correct when he issues that statement. So I've already conceded that I think everything else that he just said is accurate. I think it's accurate. And I think it's actually very, very well worded and concise and yet comprehensive at the same time. The reason why I'm not willing to give up on this idea that the Constitution is just a dead letter is because there's been other points in our nation's history where people have questioned the Constitution, or maybe have amended the Constitutions in ways that I didn't like, other times in ways that I did like. The reason why the Constitution continues to have power for someone like me is because I still think that in many respects, it can be held up as one of the most aspirational documents in world history with respect to the way that government should be organized, insofar as governments should exist. And I do think the fact that it stands out as, I think, an idea worth fighting for and worth defending continues to give it power. Because one of the problems with the Black Pill movement is that I see them as being very effective sometimes at identifying what the problems are. I don't see them offering a number of solutions that I would get on board with. In fact, if I look at most of the Black Pill community, it kind of ends there, right? It ends there with like, well, it's just a dead piece of paper. Okay, great. Well, thank you for articulating the problems. I agree with many that you just articulated. Now what? Just fighting in the street until what? One warlord wins? Like, what do you do? Not being flippant here. What do you do? And when I look at like the neo-reactionaries that we've discussed before, and they start talking about all these various systems of government, like, okay, that's interesting, but honestly, most of them are not offering something that I would replace with an honest interpretation and enforcement of our own constitutional principles. And so I'm not claiming to have all of the answers or even a perfect answer, because ultimately I don't think we get any sort of perfect system this side of heaven, because it will always be administered by infallible or by fallible human beings. But insofar as we have a constitution to fight for and a standard which we can aspire to, I think we have something that we can rally behind. We have something we can point to and say, no, we are insisting upon this. The point where he is correct is the Constitution does become a dead letter the moment everyone is convinced that it's a dead letter. The left because they want it to be dead, and the right because they're still just mourning it. What I'm interested in is people that are actually willing to practically fight for it. Because if you can get enough of that, you can push back. If Texas stands up and says, no, we're doing this not because we're throwing out the Constitution as a dead letter. We're doing this because we expect you to fulfill your responsibilities. If you're not going to, we are going to push back, because we have that right as a sovereign state, as a signatory to this contract with the federal government. And we will use it to hold you accountable. We won't stand by and hope that one day you decide that, oh gosh, yeah, we were wrong. That's been the problem with the conservative movement, is they've thought that we can just stand up on a state legislature or before a judge and just say, well, look, they're wrong in the Constitution. And what he's pointing out is that even when we have a court that says, yep, you're right, people like the Biden administration says, yeah, and we don't really care. But this is the chance. This is the chance for Texas, not despite the Constitution, but ultimately in defense for it, can stand up and say, no, the federal government doesn't get the final say over what the Constitution means. You see, that was the whole point of what Jefferson was trying to say. That if the Supreme Court ultimately can decide what the Constitution says and what it doesn't, or what is the full and complete interpretation of the Constitution, then essentially what you have is no such thing as federalism. Because now a branch of the federal government gets to decide what the contract means. Let me ask you something. Would you sign a contract for pretty much anything in your life, which written into the contract said, okay, you and I are engaging in a voluntary transaction. We're going to engage in a voluntary contract, which is going to lay out all the duties and responsibilities as well as benefits and privileges of both sides to this contract. But if we ever get to a point where we disagree on those benefits or privileges or duties and responsibilities, well, then our side gets to decide who's right and who's wrong. No, you wouldn't sign that contract. And guess what? Neither did the states when they entered in to this contract with the creation of the federal government. The states didn't just simply say, well, I guess whatever the Supreme Court says or whatever the federal government says, I guess that just goes from now on forever. That's what Jefferson was trying to say. That's what he was trying to articulate. He wasn't listing off something that states should just use arbitrarily or whenever they felt like it or as a way to push back. He wanted to preserve a close union of states, but he also wanted to articulate that if all that we did with the signing of the Constitution was ultimately hand over any say to what the Constitution said to the federal government, well, that wouldn't be a very wise contract. And so here's the mechanism where states can push back legally and morally should the federal government ever decide to either fail in their responsibilities to the state, overstep their boundaries, or in this case, proactively work to subvert their own responsibilities and work in concert with the people that they're actually supposed to be taking action against. That's what actually needs to happen, and Texas has an opportunity to do it, and I pray to God they do. Not because the Constitution is dead, but because I think they have a chance to actually give it new life. That's my take.
That's a good response. I mean, the follow-up question that I would have, and I'll posit this to Tina as well.
Oh my gosh, are you serious? Nick just totally said the greatest.
No, he did.
I'm sitting here like I have nothing to add. I'm still here though. Hi.
You will definitely have something to add because it
I'm right there with you, Tina.
it is a good take, and at some point, one thing that I watched on YouTube that I never really imagined that I would watch a lot of is debates between classical liberals and neo-reactionaries, because they exist. And a lot of times there'll be some YouTube personality, and they're not really large, right? Because we're talking about relatively small movements. Let's be honest, even with classical liberals, I mean, we're a minority within our own party, let's be honest, right? So they're relatively small movements, and they'll not get a ton of views. They'll get like 20,000 views or something like that. But these debates are interesting because they start off with, well, look, we actually probably agree on 60 to 80% of stuff, and that might even be generous depending on the way that you look at it. It might even be more like 80 or even 90%. But we disagree with the mechanism through which we can defeat the left, right? Many times the classical liberal will be like, you think that we need to basically undo the American Revolution. And I think that we need to reapply the principles of that revolution that we've largely forgotten. And then that's where they get into their disagreements over how do you get to this similar desired end state. And what you articulated there wasn't like a full refutation of the black pill. It was an admission that there's a lot of truth in this case in this tweet from this person. And I'm not saying this person's a neo-reaction or anything like that. I don't know anything about this, but I just saw this take, and I thought it was a good take that articulated the problem that we're in. And you recognize that there is a serious problem. You didn't deny it. That'd be the blue pill take, right? No, instead you offered a white pill, which is you're recognizing that there's a black pill, but you're also saying that there is, light at the end of the tunnel if you keep working. There's something to be optimistic towards and to work towards. And so, like, at some point, we've got to get you like to debate one of these people that have given up on the Constitution, not because they think it's an evil document like the left does that preserves oppressive
they just think
power
it's
structures.
Ineffectual.
They think it was a in the words of John Adams, it was written for a moral and religious people and no one else. And unfortunately, we're not living in a time filled with a bunch of morally religious people. And it's a great aspirational document that failed, is their take, basically. That either the Constitution authorized the government that we currently live under, or it was incapable of preventing the emergence of said government. And either way, it ended up becoming a dead end. So, like, at some point, I'd love to see you debate somebody like that. But the follow-up question that I have for you is, what do you say to somebody who points out, well, the Constitution can't defend itself, like you just mentioned, but it doesn't matter if we're constantly working to defend it because they, the left, will never accept it as the supreme law. And so we have to wage this never-ending battle where we obey it and respect it and try to preserve it and maintain it, even when it doesn't suit our own political ends or purposes. We have to limit ourselves with this document because it limits government, right? It limits the ring, to use the analogy. Mm-hmm. But they don't have to. They don't have to obey any of those rules or restrictions. In fact, they're going to act. It doesn't matter how often we win a fight, a political fight, a court battle, an election. They will always endlessly wage war on this document, never ending. We could win this fight, over the illegal immigration, thing, and they're still going to push sanctuary cities and open borders anytime that they have an opportunity. We can win the fight on the Interstate Commerce Clause. They're still going to regulate it. We can win the fight on guns. They're still going to try to regulate it. They're just going to ignore it over and over and over again, just like Joe Biden ignored the Supreme Court's ruling on the student loan debt, just like the Obama administration ignored many restrictions on the Constitution and bragged about it. The left is playing a game where they're celebrating the fact that they're ignoring the rules of the game, and we're constantly crying foul, but we can't get them to actually come onto the field and follow those rules.
We keep appealing to a standard they don't recognize.
Yes.
And so even if you have a legal victory here, a legal victory there, how do you ultimately it's a war of attrition. That how do you win when again you're appealing to a standard they don't recognize, or they only recognize it sometimes, and what it equates to is you having to fight with one arm behind your back while they're sitting there hitting you with a brick. And I'm sympathetic to that argument. My point is that what's going on with Texas right now is us picking up our own brick on behalf of the Constitution, right? That's where we get in this concept that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. What is contained within the Constitution and what you see replicated in state constitutions all over the country is once again this idea of a certain system of government and system of guidelines. Now, we can all look at the things that fundamentally got us to this point, and there's a reason why I am constantly hammering on government administration of education. Because I don't think any of us should be surprised that when the government is the primary entity responsible for educating your children, that it teaches your children to essentially worship government. Or essentially believe that, whatever form of it, like, democracy is now the way that we decide what is good and what is moral and what is just. Right? Don't be shocked when Vodi Bakum said it best when he said, you can't keep sending your kids off to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come home as Romans. So to your point, if even the neo-reactionaries agree that the Constitution is a very good concept, but it basically failed on its purpose because people stopped being willing to fight for it. Well, my question back to them is, okay, great. Now show me the system of government that hasn't been corrupted by people. The real question is, how do you prevent the internal corruption which takes place within inside us? That whole concept of we have met the enemy and it is us, right? It's not just kind of a funny little quip. If you look at it, there's actually a deeper philosophical meaning to that. This is one of the things where, again, and this is another area where I think that Christianity has a response for this that I think really does a good job of explaining the human condition. And that is the idea of a sinful nature, of this idea, this corrupting influence that we have to fight against. And so if you want to save the country, right, I honestly believe you could do it in a generation. You could do it in a generation. Are you getting married? Are you having kids? And then what are you teaching your kids? What are you raising them to believe? I will never stop believing that. There is a reason why. There's a reason why the same party which treats abortion as it's one of the highest manifestations of female empowerment. There's a reason why the same party that seems to be just diametrically opposed to the traditional family. There's a reason why the same political party which is attempting to push and encourage active confusion with respect to sexual identity is also the same political party that's desperately trying to let as many people into the country as possible and then immediately get them dependent on the state for their well-being and their education. Here's the dirty little secret, everybody. The left doesn't procreate at a rate necessary to actually push their agenda. That's why they need your kids. And they get them in the government school system and in higher ed and in arts and entertainment. And they're trying to do with immigration. Here's the other thing too, and Christian, you kind of alluded to this, and I think it's a very important point. What the left is going to realize probably all too late is a lot of the people that are coming into the country that they're saying, yeah, welcome, come in, here's all these benefits, and the hope that they will become dependent upon them. They're actually falling prey to the original mechanism for Marxism and central control that failed initially. They're trying to get them over on economic terms. And then they're immediately trying to get their kids away from them and their families and into a government-run school system so they can re-educate them in the way that they think they should think. Because again, they're not producing enough of their own children. They openly discourage it. So here's what I would tell you. You want to fight back? You want a generation that actually believes in the fundamental principles which inform the Constitution? You want to take you want to save the Constitution from being if you want to save the Constitution from being parchment and calligraphy, and actually add genuine philosophical strength to it again, then raise a generation to understand why it had philosophical strength in the first place. And you have that within your power, and guess what? You don't even got to ask permission. But again, the dirty little secret on our side is that we're waiting for a political strongman to do it for us, or we think we can solve it by going to a school board meeting, or we think we can solve it in the next election cycle, or we think we can solve it just by moving to a different state. When in reality, the way that you're going to solve it is starting off with the way that you raise your own family. That's the reality. There's no substitute. If you want to convince me there's a substitute, I'd be happy to listen. I will be absolutely thrilled to find out there's an easier way to do this. But here's what I'll tell you. I'm not offering an easy way to actually accomplish this, but I am offering a way that I actually think is not just, we focus sometimes on the difficulty of it or the sacrifice associated with it. I can tell you right now, actually building a strong family with someone that you love, and then pouring in and pouring into your children's education and worldview, and then fostering those close relationships and being a part of their lives to the extent possible. Yeah, there may be sacrifice involved with it. My gosh, does it give a great deal of meaning and purpose to one's life. And sometimes it will not happen the way that we work despite our best efforts. That's true. People can always choose to go their own way. But my gosh, if you're asking me what the method is or what the formula is to actually fight back, that's it. That's how you do it. And that's what I'll continue to advocate for.
That was a great way to tee up the last segment of this podcast, which I hinted at the very beginning when you were doing the introductions, Nick. And I said, if you stick around to the end, we get to talk about some really spicy stuff, which is, what's on the horizon, because it looks like that there's a showdown between the federal government and the states over this. Mm-hmm. Before I jump into that, though, there's one last point that I really just want to briefly touch on. There's a lot of people on the right that, the whole concept of this hypothetical Caesar figure has become mainstream, basically. I've seen people that are not reactionaries that are now talking about this. And Nick, you and I have had many conversations about this. We think that we're actually more likely to get a Sulla first, if you're going to use the analogy. But I think a lot of people are looking towards a Caesar-like figure because they feel like that, okay, well, he will crush the wokies and then save society and civilization from descending into this just raw degeneracy where everything falls apart. Again, the zombie apocalypse, right? That if we get somebody like that, he'll just crush the woke left, and then that will be the end of it, and we'll be fine. But there's something to be said about how, Rome started off with Augustus, right? Somebody who actively tried to pass and press like public moral laws about virtue and stuff like that, right? And where did Rome end up with? They ended up with somebody like Elagabalus eventually.
Yeah, Caligula.
And Caligula and Honorius. And the most prime example of raw degeneracy that you could possibly think of at the head of it all. And so the idea that if you just outsource everything to a Caesar-like figure and that, great, we'll crush the wokies at that point with the Caesar, and then we'll preserve the light of civilization and we won't fall into this trap of degeneracy that will destroy us. The historical record doesn't necessarily pan out that way. You could certainly argue that it delays it, that it delays the degeneracy, that it delays the hedonism, and it delays the cultural rot. But Rome ended up in degeneracy and cultural rot and paid for it in the form of its own disintegration, ultimately. So I just wanted to bring that up briefly because you kind of hinted at it at the end of your monologue there, and I didn't want to just move on to the next segment without.
Well, no, and I'll tell you this because I know we got to wrap this up. I mean, one of the great ways to, again, how do you prepare yourself for, I think everyone needs to understand that there's going to be hard times ahead. There just is. When you look at the financial situation, when you look at, again, some of it, just the cultural degeneracy that has taken place, there's going to be hard times ahead. And one of the ways that you prepare for that, is protein. And that's where Good Ranchers comes in.
Oh my goodness. We forgot.
I was waiting for it. I was like about to message Hamilton and be like, did we not put that
my
in
friends,
there?
is where Good Ranchers come in, because I'm going to tell you right now, despite what happens, there's going to be hard times ahead, and you've got to adequately prepare, right? You've got to adequately prepare. And you're not going to do that eating just vegetables. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. You need protein, all right? And Good Ranchers is going to give you the best beef, poultry, pork, wild-caught seafood delivered to your door. And if you go to goodranchers.com, you use promo code Nick in the month of January, they're going to give you free chicken with your subscription. So now not only is the best protein in the country coming to your door for you in order to prepare you for these difficult, challenging days ahead so that you can do so feeling good about yourself and what the future is actually going to look like. So you can be in peak physical condition in order to do that. You're going to get free shipping. You're going to get free chicken to go along with that subscription. You're going to get other discounts. So goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, set yourself up and properly prepare and put your family in the best position possible. All right,
let's talk about the most fun part of the show, which is going to be the inevitable constitutional crisis where the Texas, you've joked about this before, about the Texas Rangers standing off against, the FBI or whatever. It's looking like, believe it or not, that might actually happen. So I've got a couple tweets that I want to show you.
It's Texas too. I mean, Texas is like, it wasn't long ago that we didn't need you all.
Yeah, I mean, what better state to like actively engage in interposition than Texas?
Can I bring up one thing real quick?
Sure.
This whole situation actually really reminds me of something probably about 20 years ago that Nick wrote, talking about, it was sort of a fictional
it was a prediction of the future.
It was like it was sort of like a story form of what if this happened, and Texas had seceded. And they were what was it?
They hadn't. No, what had happened was we were kind of like, again, I was talking with some friends and all. We were kind of like discussing this idea of a constitutional crisis and what would that look like within a federalist system, and the scenario that we had. I can't even remember what the catalyst was at that particular point. But what we had talked about was some sort of scenario where, again, the federal government had essentially overstepped its boundaries. Texas had initially pushed back with respect to nullification, and then they went so far as interposition. And then the federal government decided to intervene economically. So eventually it started pulling any sort of, economic funding that was going in to Texas. So basically Texas was still paying all of its taxes, but now it wasn't getting any of the benefit of like transportation dollars or Medicaid spending or any of the things associated with that. And so the federal government kind of turned off the spigot. And so Texas responded by turning off their spigot to the federal government and essentially told people in Texas, you no longer, there's no longer automatic withdrawal. You don't got to pay federal taxes. You don't got to do any of that. And so it was this escalation of things where then the federal government essentially pushed in and attempted to use the interstate commerce clause to say that, okay, fine, well, if you're not going to abide by federal law and you're not going to respect the authority and you're going to withhold taxes, well, then, we're not going to enforce your border, which who cares? They're not doing that anyways. But then we're also not going to allow you the benefit of the free trade zone, which is the United States. So essentially the federal government was telling Texas, like, okay, fine, any products leaving Texas to go to other states are now subject to tariffs or impoundment or anything else. And they thought, well, now we're gonna really have Texas over a barrel because we're gonna hurt their trade ability. And Texas basically, and then what ended up happening is states like Louisiana, Oklahoma, and others were in a position where it's like, well, we're not going to stop trading with Texas. Like, we're not going to do this. We're not going along with the federal government. Not to mention the fact that then Texas was in a position where it said, well, then fine. If you want to move to Texas, you no longer have to pay any federal taxes. And so businesses started to be like, well, wait a second. Like, nobody's really respecting this trade ban with Texas. And if we move to Texas, well, now this is interesting. And so you started to see these states, and it wasn't like everybody just seceded from the union and we all had a civil war. It was more of like this escalating back and forth between the state and the feds, and then various state, like California obviously saying, yes, we will abide by the federal trade embargo with Texas. And then like all these other states going, well, we're not going to do that. Right. And then the federal government running into this crisis of saying, okay, we have this enormous debt and we're not actually generating enough tax revenue. So we're running into this problem where how do we actually enforce these things, which are kind of unenforceable unless the states agree to it. And you just kind of saw this gradual escalation as a result. And honestly, I'm not predicting that's what's going to happen.
I'd love to go back and find what you wrote on that, because it was, it was long, like it was very involved, but all of this is really sounding like maybe that was actually prophetic, honey.
Like I said, it was a prediction of the future. So,
well, but you can see how, again, people immediately go in their mind to, I don't like this, secede war.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's not typically how these things escalate. There's usually kind of like a back and forth and a pushback, and sometimes one side, balks first or one side concedes, and then there's, gradual escalation, and it's only at a point where you actually have the sides thinking, okay, we could pull this off. Or one side or both sides have become so intransigent that there's no mechanism for peaceful resolution. And then you run into a situation of secession. But I mean, I can imagine a situation where you do reach that kind of constitutional crisis, and the federal government sees its primary mechanism for punishing the states, the withholding of federal funds. And, that might be more effective against states which are not net taxpayers or whatnot. And a lot of times blue states will brag about, well, we pay more into taxes than we actually receive back. And again, there's something of a misnomer, because a lot of the money that will come out of those states it's not like they're going to red states in the form of, a bunch of conservatives are getting paychecks. A lot of times it's it'd be red or blue taxpayers in a blue state that are paying for subsidies that are going to blue voters in a red state. Or red states tend to have more military bases. And so again, those defense expenditures or whatnot. So there's various ways to explain it. It's not as easy as a lot of the blue states want to kind of make it out to be, but you can definitely see a situation where a state like Texas, which is a very sizable economy, Florida, the same thing. The largest economy of any state is California, followed by, I believe,
Texas is number 2.
Texas is number 2, and then number 3 is, I think, New York.
Well, Florida now has a larger population, so it's
So
if you want me to look it up,
tough,
I can. It's very close.
Yeah, but you can see those situations where, again, can you imagine a Governor DeSantis saying, "Oh yeah, okay, federal government, if you say we're not allowed to trade with Texas, or we have to apply extra tariffs as a result of it, then I guess we'll do that." Like, I don't think so. Yeah, I think I had it right.
It is close. New York is
California,
number 3,
Texas,
and then
New York, then
Texas,
Florida. Yeah, and so that's the part where you start to look at those things and you start to wonder, okay, how would this transpire? And again, like I said, I don't think it's the situation where you have this huge block of more conservative states or red states that decide to just secede, right? I don't see that. I think it's more of just, no, we're going to engage in nullification as well. Okay, and you might have some states kind of on the periphery that say, okay, federal government, you've kind of pushed this a little bit too far. Maybe it's time to rein it in a little bit, or maybe it's time to get reconciliation. And then you have other states, maybe like California or New York, that are like, no, screw this. They need to be punished. And that's really the question. Do you have a majority of states that say, okay, let's effect some sort of peaceful resolution of this? And maybe it manifests itself in kind of a rebirth of federalism, where once again we say, okay, look, we don't want a crisis like that. And so we're going to go back to the way this was always intended, which is California, you go ahead and be as Marxist as you like. These other states are going to be more conservative, and the federal government is going to stay more focused on the things it's supposed to do. Or you have a scenario where those states go, screw that, we're going to force their compliance. And then they end up almost acting like it's a patriotic mission on their point to bring Texas or Florida or, whatever other states to heel. And that's the part where you could actually see, something that is a little bit more violent. And I don't want to see that, right? Like that is what I want to avoid. But I think we're at a point right now where, again, as Christian has articulated, if you have one side that only abides by the rules when it suits them, and then immediately tries to ignore and undermine them when it doesn't, again, sometimes the bully needs to be hit in the face to understand that bullying is a bad idea.
And the bully can be hit in the face without starting a school-wide brawl either.
Yeah, exactly.
And so this is where we get into, like I said, this is the interesting part that we promised at the beginning of this episode. This is the spicy constitutional showdown that is in the works, because I've got a couple tweets up here that came out literally within a day of the Supreme Court's ruling that indicates that, at least as of right now, Texas is not backing down. In fact, they're doubling down. So some very quick backstory. Eagle Pass, which was one of the places along the border that saw one of the largest surges of illegal immigrants coming into the United States. It was completely inundated, overrun, tens of thousands of illegal immigrants pouring through. Texas sent their own agents to Eagle Pass, which was on the border. And what they eventually concluded is that the federal government was basically, again, as we were talking earlier, not just refusing to enforce federal immigration law or defend the border, but were actively encouraging an open borders policy in the face of, again, the largest mass migration of illegal immigrants into the United States in recorded history. And so eventually Texas decided, okay, you guys are literally facilitating a problem that you're supposed to be solving. Not only are you not solving it, you're creating the problem, so you're just not going to be here anymore. And Texas literally kicked them out, like kicked the federal agents out of Eagle Pass. And obviously the federal government sent them an ultimatum and said, you need to give us back access to it. And Texas told them to go pound sand, and that's still being debated. And so right after that Supreme Court ruling that said that, yeah, the federal government can cut the razor wire, Texas's Governor Greg Abbott came out and tweeted that Texas's National Guard continues to hold the line in Eagle Pass. Texas will not back down from our efforts to secure the border in Biden's absence. And he tweeted 2 photos showing that members of the Texas National Guard are still in possession of this crucial border crossing, and there's still, obstacles in place and stuff like that to secure the border, including the razor wire and some other things. And it sounds like that Abbott is doubling down. He also put out a statement immediately after the ruling and said this isn't over yet. And there was another tweet that came out, and this is somebody that posted some video footage that said, today Texas's National Guard is busy putting up more razor wire and barriers at Shelby Park in Eagle Pass, Texas. And again, it shows a video of the same thing. This is the same exact stuff that the Supreme Court recently just said they're not allowed to do. And we have videos and footage and photos and tweets from Texas's own governor indicating that, yeah, that's great. The Supreme Court ruled this way. We're still going to do it.
Yes.
And so it is starting to look like that Texas is calling the Supreme Court's bluff. And not just the Supreme Court, Texas is calling the federal government's bluff.
That's what, again, I don't think this is so much a Supreme Court bluff. I think it's a federal government bluff. It's a Biden administration bluff. And that's the part where, again, this is what we've been saying for a while. This isn't about brinksmanship. This isn't about, being flippant. This isn't about not supporting the Constitution. This is about insisting on the Constitution. And this is the only, again, Texas did not put themselves in this position. The Biden administration put Texas in this position. And Texas is saying, surprisingly enough, right, the don't mess with Texas, is saying, we're not going to roll over and take this. So no, we're going to do this. Ball's in your court. And I really want to see what the Biden administration does at this point.
So here's the question to everybody. Because it's kind of obvious that we all think that this was the right move by Texas to double down, not back down.
I know.
I hope.
I just reposted his thing and added a quote to it.
I really hope. Well, that's good. I really, really hope that Greg Abbott does not back down on this, because that he's probably under immense pressure to do it. And Abbott did not necessarily run for governor the first time on, I'm going to create a constitutional crisis with the federal government, right? That wasn't his campaign platform the first time. Now, some conservatives might be like, and that's the problem. We need people to run for office that are intentionally going to pick fights with the federal government. And increasingly, I'm moving in that direction more. I think that one of the questions you need to be asking your your gubernatorial candidates is, what are you going to do to push back against federal overreach? It's not enough to just say, I don't support this. What are you going to do to put a stop to it? Because states, unless we go the Caesar route, which we've talked about at length about how that is not an ideal situation, then
Chris, I don't want to.
States are our best option.
I agree with you.
So what do you think is going to happen?
I already kind of said that. Like I think Texas is going to push back. I think the federal government is going to. I think the first thing they're going to do is scream and cry about, well, the Supreme Court said you can't, right? Like, but that's like, okay, but what are you going to do? Like, are you going to have, again, you won't actually do your job. You've spent time and resources suing states trying to do your job for you. Are you now going to spend time and resources arresting? You're going to arrest Texas Rangers? You're going to arrest sheriffs on the border? Like, are you going to do that? And I think you got a lot of people that are going to be willing to put them in that position and say, are you prepared? Because we are. And that's going to beg the question. That is really going to beg the question. And a part of what again, I don't think Joe Biden's making any decisions based off of, what Joe Biden thinks. Because if you look at Joe Biden, the beginning of his career versus now, I don't think he's evolved over time based off of emerging. No, I think he just gets pushed wherever the political winds blow. And the real question here is going to be, what is the hyper woke progressive wing of his party going to insist upon, especially since I think Biden is at this point a little bit scared that he ain't going to be the nominee. And so what does he have to do to secure his own base in this portion? And that's the part where, again, it gets a little bit dangerous. Like, to what extent is he willing to go? And will he go the law enforcement route first, or will he go the economic route first? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think it will essentially be one of those two approaches. And then the question is will Abbott feel enough support both internally within his own legislature, within his attorney general is definitely willing to go to fight. Will he feel enough support within his own population? And then will he feel enough support from, neighboring states and other like-minded states that also feel that this is unreasonable and unlawful? And again, that's a lot to predict. So I'll just say that I think the ball has officially been put in the federal government's side right now, the court, and they're going to have to decide: do they want to try to go after him kind of economically, or use the power of the purse? Are there other things that they might try to do, or are they really going to actually send federal agents to start arresting, Texas law enforcement or local law enforcement? And once we see that, then it'll be the question of how does Abbott respond to that? Because that is certainly an escalation at that point, and that's also a point where you might see other states get involved. I mean, Virginia, the governor of Virginia actually sent Virginia National Guard down to the southern border to assist Texas. Now they were providing, I think, like medical and logistical support and things of that nature. But again, that's the part where you're going to beg the question. And like I said, I think you're going to see a lot of people in red states looking at their governor going, I don't want you to stand passively by and watch what happens in Texas. I want you to proactively come out and support them and look for practical ways that you can actually do that. And again, that's the mechanism of escalation that I could see happening to this. And it really becomes a question there of who backs down first. And that's going to be a question of who comes to Abbott's aid versus who comes to Biden's aid. So that's my prediction, such as it is.
Tina, do you agree? Or
I think Abbott should annex everything all the way down to the Panama Canal, and make that all part of Texas, and let the federal government come down and throw a fit if they want to.
Oh my God. I'm like, here's kind of the nuanced way that I think this can work. And Tina's like, I think they should just invade Central America.
Pretty much. They're invading us already. All of these people are seeking refugee status into our country. So naturally, we should just take it and colonize
Christian,
all of it.
You won't have
Christian,
an immigration
this is why,
crisis
Christian, I hope you know.
Annex them.
Christian and Hamilton, I hope you know this is why we will never be as popular as Tina on this podcast.
Maybe that's that. There's a lot of evidence.
Well, think about it this way: the U.S. treats its own citizens worse than it treats immigrants or illegal immigrants. So just make them all U.S. citizens. Maybe that might.
Become the United
Tina's
States
going to make a T-shirt that's going to show the United States
if we're going
minus
into
Texas,
Mexico,
Texas.
Then we better be going into Canada next.
Annex everything north of Colombia.
If we're going full,
That's a much easier border to secure.
If we're going full United States of North America, we better be taking out Canada next. Liberate them from Trudeau. But I'm sure that they'll welcome us at this point.
Gosh.
But I mean, maybe Quebec wouldn't. We could give them independence.
I'm sorry, I had to do that, you guys.
No, it's fine.
It was way too weighty.
It was. I mean, it was an open-ended question
man.
that, like, I mean, quite frankly, I don't really know where this is going to go. The pessimist in me, and if you've listened to enough of our podcasts, you know that my takes are a lot more pessimistic than Nick's takes. We balance each other out in that respect. Like the pessimist in me thinks that, like, oh yeah, Abbott's going to back down eventually, or what's going to happen is Abbott will lose political support within his own state where, rhinos in the legislature want to back down and, federal funding, we can't do this. Or the National Guard within Texas will back down, because what happens when those Guard members go home at night? Because they're not there 24/7. So what happens when they go home and they're by themselves and then federal agents show up to their house and arrest them? Mm-hmm. And you know what I mean? And so, like, what do you do as the governor of Texas when your state employees, your guard that you're directing to secure the border, are finding themselves being arrested by the FBI?
Or they don't even arrest them. They just freeze their bank accounts.
They go the Trudeau route, right? They go the Canada route. And so, like, I'm really worried that this can go in one of two ways. Either it fizzles out for all those reasons I just outlined, or it spirals out of control. And I think it's far more likely that it fizzles out than it spirals out of control. I mean, the ideal scenario is that it follows this middle path where it doesn't fizzle out and it doesn't spiral out of control, and it results in a pushback against the federal government where the federal government backs down. But until I see that happen, I'm going to be skeptical that it will.
Well, and let's also just say that again, we've got a pretty significant election cycle going on right now, and Biden is not thinking about this purely in terms of what's best for the country and how do I faithfully execute my responsibilities as commander in chief. He's thinking, how do I stay in power? And that's going to be an interesting question, because I think he's worked himself into kind of a no-win situation right now. And again, there's a huge opportunity right now on the Republican side, from the political side of this, to be able to offer a legitimate alternative. And again, that's going to be interesting to see and to see what happens. I mean, look, we've gone a while here. We're kind of, I think we're getting close to the 2-hour mark at this point. So listen, I'm gonna wrap this up because we need to, and because I got some stuff I need to do with the legislature and whatnot in preparation for tomorrow. So here's what I'm going to say. Again, I want to thank Christian for all the work that he did, not only bringing up a lot of the articles, but a lot of those graphs, which I think really do a great job of kind of illustrating the point for this. And for our audio listeners, I hope we did a decent job of actually articulating what we were seeing in those graphs, because it really is just mind blowing. And then again, when it comes to this overall issue of what happens next and how does this potentially end? I do see, I want to end it on an optimistic note. I do see a political solution here, provided that the people that actually do believe in the Constitution and do believe in the fundamental nature of what the United States is and was always meant to be, if they actually stand up in this moment, at this point, Governor Abbott is a huge opportunity here. And again, it's also going to be a question of how Donald Trump and how other people, explain and articulate this, and then offer an alternative and explain how it doesn't have to be this way. And then actually provides, real plans for how you're going to correct on this. And I think if Abbott does the right thing, I think Biden is going to have to really, eat this. And then the question is what do the Democrats do? Do they stick with Biden? They try to put someone else in there? And are we providing a reasonable alternative so that, as Christian said, this doesn't just fizzle out and go away, that we actually address the underlying problems which got us to this point, but by the same token, doesn't blow up into something that I hope none of us really want to see. Because I do want the preservation of the United States, but I want the preservation of the United States in a way that actually respects the United States Constitution and the fundamental principles upon which this country was born. And it wasn't born on just getting to elect people. It was born on a respect for individual liberty, self-determination, property rights, free markets, and your right to be able to live your life the way you want, provided you're not infringing on the rights of others to do the same. That is a principle I think is worth fighting for. I hope we will continue to do so. And I applaud Governor Abbott in what is a very difficult situation right here. And I certainly encourage other governors that also see the problems that got us to this point, and I hope they will have the courage to stand up and say, we're not going to make Abbott fight this alone. So once again, thank you very much for joining us for this episode, and we will see you next time.